The Casey Anthony trial was more than 15 years ago, yet it is firmly fixed in our memories. Perhaps due to the horrible details of what transpired, but maybe because it was the most watched trial since the O.J. Simpson trial. So where is Casey Anthony now? Where is her mom and dad? Do they still have a relationship with each other? What are they up to now? These and more questions I hope to answer in the next few minutes as we dive into the details I could find, thanks to the excellent reporting of People magazine and other resources, as well as my own memory of the events at the time. This is True Crime Craft Time, where we discuss a well-known crime from the past or present while I create something new, whether it's a painting, a craft, a junk journal, some ephemera, or just something random I enjoy making. Feel free to craft with me or just sit and enjoy the storytelling, and at the end I might share a few of my own thoughts and feelings and give you a chance to pile on or just share your own thoughts. As always, much appreciation to anyone sharing the video with others, subscribing, and commenting. I love to hear from all of you. I remember clearly when Casey Anthony burst on the scene in the media, not because her 2-year-old daughter Kaylee was missing, but because Casey had known this for 30 days, never reported it to the grandparents, nor to the police, nor to anyone. Casey Marie Anthony was a single mom, born March 19, 1986, living in Orlando, Florida with her parents, Cindy and George Anthony. It was 2008. Her vehicle had been impounded, so her dad retrieved it, noticing a strong odor in the back. George was, I believe, a former police officer. During that month, Casey stayed with friends and was seen and photographed going to nightclubs and dancing, seemingly without a care in the world regarding her missing toddler. It wasn't until Cindy, Casey's mom, called 911 to report that the little tot named Kaylee had been missing for 30 days, but she also claimed the vehicle they retrieved smelled as if a dead body had been in it, that it became big-time news everywhere. Cindy was a nurse or worked in a clinic, and she knew the odor of human remains, as would her policeman husband George. I've been told that once you connect with that odor, you never forget it. Casey then proceeded to dig a huge hole for herself, first claiming she thought she could find the child on her own to explain her silence, then claiming a babysitter by the name of Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, whom no one had ever met nor heard of before, had kidnapped the girl. She then took police on a wild goose chase to her former place of employment, pretending that she still worked there and giving out information that never checked out. The babysitter never existed, although there was a woman by that name in the area who for a time was scrutinized by the police and the public, and whose life was turned into a living hell as a result. She had no involvement with Casey nor her child. July 16, 2008, Casey was arrested and charged with the following: making false statements to law enforcement and child neglect. Numerous attempts were made by Cindy Anthony when visiting Casey in prison to get her daughter to reveal what happened to Kaylee, all recorded by the prison. These attempts were to no avail. Casey even got angry at one point that people were more concerned about her missing daughter than they were about her. That narcissism really drew the ire of the public. Meanwhile, it eventually came out that someone in the household had done computer searches regarding chloroform, and speculation flew everywhere that Casey had used chloroform to put her child to sleep in the car while she went dancing, and that she eventually had overdosed Kaylee and unalived her. Later, when Casey accused her mother of doing the searches, it was proved by her work log that she was at work when the searches were made. George would have no ability or reason to break into Casey's MySpace account. The person making the searches was Casey. It wasn't long before Casey became a person of interest on July 22. Searches were conducted all over the place, but no one found little Kaylee until her skeletal remains were found on December 11, 2008. They lay like tossed-out garbage in a wooded area near the parents' home and had been ravaged by animals in the meantime. Years went by. Finally, Casey went to trial on May 24, 2011. Her attorney was a relatively inexperienced capital case attorney named Jose Baez, who had never before defended a high-profile case. Sorry, but I have to work around YouTube's strict censorship policies, so some words have to be abbreviated or somehow minimized. At this time, Casey testified that her daughter drowned in the family pool, that the grandfather, George, tried to cover it up, in spite of being an accidental death. Further, Casey alleged her father inappropriately touched her when she was a child. This was, she explained, why she feels compelled to lie so often. People also noticed what appeared to be an inappropriate relationship she had with Jose Baez. It isn't until now that evidence has emerged allegedly that she paid for her defense not with cash, as she had no cash, but with sexual favors, according to the man Baez hired to investigate the DNA evidence. The trial lasted about 2 months, with closing arguments given by the attorneys on July 3, 2011. The jury deliberated 2 days, and finally the verdict was announced: not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated CA, and not guilty of aggravated manslaughter. She was convicted, however, of 4 misdemeanor counts of giving false information to law enforcement officers, and she received a 4-year sentence and a $4,000 fine. But because she had already served most of that time in prison awaiting her trial, she was released from prison shortly after on July 17. This was in spite of the computer search evidence. I think it's safe to say the majority of society was outraged by the verdict, believing that Casey had carelessly unalived her little one to have a social life in nightclubs. A Florida Department of Corrections spokeswoman described her as, quote, one of the most hated women in America, unquote. It was a moniker that stuck. According to Nielsen research, around 40 million Americans watched some or all of the trial, and the verdict was viewed by more than 100 million people worldwide. Former chief judge in the case, Belvin Perry, watched as Baez presented his defense case. Quote, what I learned during that trial, even though he was a neophyte at the time, I learned that, 1, he was a great strategist, unquote, Perry said. 2, he knew how to deal and appeal to jurors. 3, he was well prepared, unquote. The retired judge said he believes she may have accidentally unalived her 2-year-old daughter with chloroform. Afterward, Her so-called novice attorney was hailed as a brilliant defense attorney and has continued on to represent other high-profile defendants in their trials. Casey Anthony went on to live an undisclosed reclusive life for many years. In her first interview in March 2017 with the Associated Press, she said, quote, "Based off what was in the media, I understand the reasons people feel about me. I understand why people have the opinions that they do," unquote. Then, in December 2020, now in her 30s, she filed paperwork to start her own private investigation business in Florida. The name of the venture is Case Research and Consulting Services, LLC. Patrick McKenna, who was Casey's lead investigator during the trial, registered the LLC to a home he owns in West Palm Beach. And I just learned that Casey had lived with him. I don't know if she still is, but she lived with him and his family for several years after the trial. State records show she does not have a Florida private investigator's license, and because she is a convicted felon, she will not be able to obtain one. Reportedly, Casey wants to, quote, help other people who are facing serious legal charges, and that she continues to maintain her own innocence in Kaylee's death. She knows what it's like to be accused of something that she didn't do, says the source. She wants to help other wrongfully accused people, especially women, and help them get justice, unquote. That source also acknowledged that Casey had not been retained by any clients, nor had she come up with a plan for her new incorporation. It's just in the early stages, continued the source. She has big plans for her future and hopes that it will change how people see her. Her family claimed the purpose was to investigate Kaylee's unaliving. However, that might not be correct. It could just be that she has an interest in investigations about crime, or is a self-serving strategy to mend her reputation over time. Since then, a docuseries published by Peacock in November 2022 shared her side of the story. It's called Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies, and was her first televised appearance. According to her, George, quote, was standing there with her. She was soaking wet. He handed her to me, said it was my fault, that I caused it, but he didn't rush to call 911, and he wasn't trying to resuscitate her. I collapsed with her in my arms. She was heavy, and she was cold. He takes her from me, and he immediately softens his tone and says, "It's going to be okay." I wanted to believe him. He took her from me, and he went away, unquote. Then incredibly, Casey claimed that she, quote, wasn't under the impression that Kaylee was unalived, unquote, saying, "During the 31 days, I genuinely believed that Kaylee was still alive. Following his instructions, he told me what to do. I tried to act as normal as I could," unquote. But she didn't stop there. She speculated that George may have staged Kaylee's drowning in order to cover up that he had been SAing his granddaughter. Then in January 2024, George and Cindy Anthony appeared on a true crime reality show on A&E. The docuseries is titled Casey Anthony's Parents, The Lie Detector Test. Prior to filming their response, neither George nor Cindy had watched Casey's docuseries because they knew her to be a liar and could not believe anything she would say. Therefore, they had no prior knowledge of her final accusations against George. The premise for their personal series was for them to view Casey's series live and respond to it in the moment. That would then be followed by both of them taking lie detector tests, also live, with the results given at the end of filming. Naturally, her claims outraged and appalled George. He denies it all, a source said. It wasn't true in 2011 and it's not true now. He will keep denying it all until his final breath, unquote, said the source within the family inner circle. Continuing, the source said, quote, George is keeping a pretty strong exterior, but this tears him up. He still loves his daughter, and he loved his granddaughter, so this is beyond difficult for him. George knew he was going to be thrown under the bus, but didn't expect her to run him over so many times. She backed up the bus and ran over him again and again. He's really hurt by it, unquote. George took the polygraph test on camera, denying he ever knew Kaylee's whereabouts when the police and volunteers were searching all over for the missing little girl. However, George was very hesitant to respond on some questions regarding his knowledge, and it does make one wonder as to his veracity. The administrator had to stop and clarify questions more than once, and even then George was slow to respond. Cindy claimed she believed 100% that her daughter knew what happened to Kaylee. I recall seeing clips on TV of her talking to Casey at the prison, trying her best to get Casey to confess. She apparently then experienced a panic attack. She explained it was the only reason she put herself through all of that drama. Reportedly, the Anthonys mortgaged their home to generate the money to defend their daughter. Eventually, it was reported, they lost their home altogether. They risked everything they owned to defend their daughter, only to be accused by her of SA. However, the series reportedly was filmed in their home where they had lived, so I'm not sure if they lost the home or kept it, or whether it was just used for the filming, or whether they have since purchased a new home. The mother and daughter didn't speak to each other for many years after the trial. Since 2022, however, they have had some sporadic communication. A source said, quote, Cindy wanted answers. She wanted to know exactly what happened and why. She wanted Casey to explain what the hell she put everyone through. Now she realizes that there's no point asking Casey anything because she is never going to get any straight answers. So what's the point? Unquote. The near-forgotten member of the Anthony family, older brother Lee Anthony, also testified at trial. Casey accused both Lee and George of SAing her, which Lee also has denied. It wasn't the same thing that happened with my father, she said in the 2022 documentary. My brother never R-worded me. No, absolutely not. But it was close enough where there was a pattern, unquote. As of 2018, the brother and sister do not have a relationship. Lee married his longtime girlfriend, Mallory Parker, in 2012 and welcomed a baby the following year. As for George, he still doesn't have a relationship with Casey. He is considering legal action against his daughter going forward. In 2018, George was in a serious car crash, and his vehicle had flipped over several times, and it left him with critical injuries. It begs the question then, did Casey reach out to her father after his horrible accident? Answer, no. According to a source, they didn't have a relationship for years before the accident. Why would they have one now? Prior to watching Casey's docuseries, George said in an interview, quote, "I said, Casey, no matter what, I'm still your dad and I love you. That was hard for me, but I needed to get that from me because you can't move on if you keep holding on all these things inside. You need to be able to express yourself," unquote. Now there is likely no possibility of any reconciliation between father and daughter. I have long believed Casey Anthony somehow unalived her own child, possibly without intention, malice, or in a fit of anger, or that there was a cover-up to a pool accident. Were it not for the chloroform searches, a pool accident might have made sense. However, I think it to be very believable that she used chloroform to put her daughter to sleep so she could go out at night and dance and be with friends without worrying whether the girl would wake up or not. Casey did not have a job. She lived off her parents and friends. I think that most times the parents babysat the little girl, but on evenings when they couldn't, Casey possibly resorted to chloroform to put the child to sleep for an extended period of time. She may have used too much or did it too often, which led to the sad outcome that crushed everyone. I fully believe the parents had no knowledge of Kaylee's whereabouts during those 31 days, and up until the parental instincts kicked in to save their daughter's life, they believed a dead body had been in the back of her car and that she knew all along what happened to the little girl and where her body was disposed. I do not for 1 minute believe that during the 31 days of silence and partying that Casey thought her daughter was still alive. She's supposed to be a loving mother to her daughter, as her friends want you to believe. So if that's true, how come she didn't see her daughter at all during the time she stayed with boyfriends? It doesn't make any sense. Judge Judy says all the time, quote, "If it doesn't make sense, it's not true," unquote. She also quips, quote, "You know when a child is lying, their lips are moving," unquote. I have no opinion on whether her father ever harmed Casey. I don't know either of them. The same goes for the brother Lee. But I do believe it could easily be ongoing lies to improve her reputation by painting her as the real victim in this whole saga. That said, I cannot really believe this woman because she is a chronic liar. In court, if a witness is caught lying, you have the ability to then discount everything they say. One doesn't have to try to remember when telling the truth. The truth never changes. The moment a witness has a second story, that's when they should be questioned with more veracity and scrutiny. Casey has now had, 3, 4, 5 stories? Good grief. None of this was ever mentioned early on, another clue that it is manufactured solely to blame others for her own crime. It only came up as surprise testimony at trial. Baez was clever enough to know that his client had a history of lying, therefore she was practiced at it and had developed the ability to con many people, no matter what the lie entailed. That's why he put her on the stand to testify. Normally, the defendant is urged to keep silent in court. However, an attorney is never ever supposed to put a witness on the stand knowing that he or she intends to lie. I wonder how many times that law has been broken in cases all over this country. Baez's plan was to create a massive amount of blame on other people close to Casey and Kaylee to plant doubt in the minds of the jury. Therefore, all the accusations against George, Brother Lee, the meter reader who found the body, the DNA investigator hired by Baez, even Cindy herself, allegedly anyone else they could think of, was fair game. In a capital M trial, the jury's collective mindset demands an acquittal if they have the slightest doubt regarding the evidence presented. 12 people must believe 100% in a defendant's guilt, but do not confuse a not guilty verdict to mean innocence. Verdicts do not determine a defendant is innocent, just that there isn't sufficient evidence to convince 12 people that the defendant is 100% guilty. That's all it is. That's why O.J. Simpson got off. His attorneys created doubt, just enough doubt to get him off. That's all that was needed. He was convicted in the civil trial later because civil juries must only determine that, based on a preponderance of the evidence, the defendant is guilty. Doubt is not a factor in a civil trial. It is determined by what the jury finds to be most likely. In other words, the jury believes it is most likely that the defendant is guilty based on the evidence, rather than that they have a bit of doubt. Baez also knew it only takes a small amount of uncertainty to get a defendant off. Jurors naturally feel a higher level of responsibility in an M case to get it right and not convict an innocent person. In addition, he only needs one juror to believe his version, and it will be an automatic hung jury. Then he would get a do-over and would be better off once he knows the prosecution's whole case. Additionally, the case was entirely circumstantial with no direct evidence. Psychologically, no one wants to believe a young mom would deliberately do this to their own child. It just isn't a part of our psyche. Much easier to believe an accidental drowning, and with two motivated grandparents willing to say or do anything to save the life of their daughter, what other conclusion would you expect them to come to? I believe George may have been in agreement to take the blame for a drowning accident scenario to save his daughter's life. But Baez may have wanted extra security for Casey, or maybe she thought it up on her own, to claim that George essayed her as a child, so why not essay Kaylee as well, then hide it with a drowning? She could kill two birds with one stone. One, use CSA as the reason she lies so much. Two, use it as motivation for George to off the girl when she got old enough to say something. But if he harmed Kaylee as a child, yet let her live to speak about it, why would he upend the life of this small child? Nah, doesn't make sense. When a case becomes this convoluted and hearsay is rampant, usually the simplest explanation is the right one. The ideal explanation is that Kaylee accidentally drowned, or she accidentally slipped away under too much chloroform, or chloroform administered too often. Casey claims the girl was asleep next to her and would never leave the bedroom without permission, and that George awoke her because the child was absent. It wouldn't be the first time a child wandered away from a parent. Many years ago, I drove home from an errand and saw a little girl still in diapers walking down the middle of the street all alone, a half block from my home. I looked around and saw no one, so I stopped, got out of my car, picked her up, took her home with me, and called the police right away, asking them to come get her. I did not try to find the parents from any of the houses nearby because I had no way of knowing for certain who the real parents were. Hours went by and no police. I sent a friend out to buy diapers and some baby food. Eventually, the police came by and picked her up, telling me that they had first to investigate the mother because when they first spoke with her, she commented, quote, "Yeah, she sometimes wanders away," unquote, indicating that it had happened before. This was a concerning statement that needed careful scrutiny. I believe the grandparents loved Kaylee way more than Casey. They also loved Casey way more than she loved them in return. Casey just loved Casey, in my opinion. I determined early on that Casey was irresponsible and the worst thing happened, but she was fortunate enough to have parents that loved her unconditionally and willing to do anything to save her life, and she was fortunate enough for them to hire a clever attorney like Baez. She has never changed my mind. In summary, then, no one won in this case except Baez and the media, who had a heyday with this whole sad story for months and years. They made millions of dollars off of it, and they still are. Nancy Grace must have said, quote, "bombshell tonight," unquote, a million times throughout the whole ordeal to beef up her views on cable TV. A young, irresponsible woman escaped the legal consequences, but became the brunt of all sorts of awful jokes and skepticism for the rest of her life. An innocent Kaylee lost her life after 2 years. Loving grandparents lost their chance at a second daughter who didn't lie, as there had already been talk about them adopting Kaylee. And a brother lost his sister, his privacy, and his reputation. As for you and me, we got to watch, speculate, and ask why. Then we got to go home. So what's your take? Do you think Casey was harmed by her father and her brother? Do you think George was somehow involved with what happened to Kaylee? Do you think Kaylee thought her daughter was still alive during the 31 days of silence? Do you think the attorney was paid for his services via sexual services from his client? How do you feel about the outcome of the trial? Tell me. I'd really like to know. And as always, if you like this content, please give the video a like, give me a comment, and share this update with everyone you know. I would much appreciate that. This has been True Crime Craft Time, and this is Miss Darling calling this a wrap. Bye-bye.